Hi everyone, it's Ray the Singing Tallit, reading Chapter 2, Book 2 of Alfred Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. This book's about 1,000 pages long with about 200 pages of annotations, and every page has got, gosh, if you take a look here at the bottom, every page has got, oh gosh, there's hardly any footnotes. No, it looks silly. There we go. There's a good bit of footnotes. Each page contains a lot of references and footnotes, so this guy is... he's writing a scholarly work. This is not, the off-the-cuff type of stuff. This is well-cited, well-documented, written by a man who was the foremost authority on Jewry at the time of the late 1800s, at least in the Anglican Church. His family was Jewish. He was raised Jewish till he was 8 years old, and then his family converted to the Anglican Church. And so he knew a lot about the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, many of the religious writings of the Jewish community that most Christians have just never even heard of, that are a part of the tradition and are definitely a part of the life of Christ at the time that Yeshua was walking the earth and in the lives of the people who were his disciples. All right, the previous chapter we read was about the geography and the buildings of Jerusalem that Herod had made. This is going to be a section about his personal life. The personal history of Herod, the two worlds in Jerusalem. It is an intensely painful history, in the course of which Herod made his way to the throne. We look back nearly 2.5 centuries to where, with the empire of Alexander, Palestine fell to his successors. For nearly a century and a half, the continued battlefield of the Egyptians and Syrian kings. See, first, Ptolemy controlled, that's one of Alexander's generals. First, Ptolemy controlled the area we now call Israel. But then the Seleucid kings, that's Antiochus's group, then conquered it back from the Ptolemies, and the Ptolemies driven down into Egypt, and they were kept there. The Ptolemies were good to the Jews. They were not very strict or cruel to them. It wasn't until Antiochus came to power that the real crush down on Jewishness was placed on the Israelite area in what we call Israel today, or what they refer to as Palestine at the time of the writing of this book. Remember, when this book was written, the Ottoman Turk still ruled that area. It was prior to World War I. At last, it was the corrupt high priest, with which virtually the government of the land had all along lain, that betrayed Israel's trust. See, at the time of these Grecian kings that were ruling over Israel, if you were high priest in Israel, then you were pretty much the king of Israel. You had all the both religious and secular power as the head of the temple, and basically the head of any judicial government that was there as well. Let's see. The great-grandson of so noble a figure in Jewish history as Simon the Just bought from the Syrians the high priestly office of his brother, adopted the name of Jason, and sought to Grecianize the people. The sacred office fell, if possible, even lower, when through bribery it was then transferred to his brother Menelaus. Then followed the brief period of terrible persecution by Antiochus Epiphanes, when Judaism was all but exterminated in Palestine. See, what happened was they had to pay a bribe to Antiochus to become high priest. So Jason Oniad bought the office. And then shortly thereafter, another guy bribed the officials to get himself placed in as the high priest because Jason didn't pay his bribe in time. So then Jason was deposed as high priest, at which time he took the priestly order. Now, these guys were actually in the bloodline of Aaron. So they had a quote-unquote legitimate right to claim that position. However, it was only given by the king of Greece. So Jason goes down to Egypt, to the city of Heliopolis, and talks to the Ptolemies and says, hey, I want to build the temple that was prophesied in Isaiah 19:19, that there would be a temple to Jehovah in the heart of Egypt, is the way it's referred to in the prophecy. And then he built the temple of Leonatopolis, which is where the people of Alexandria would mostly go to do their sacrifices, though they would send money and resources to the temple in Jerusalem. So essentially he had created a new temple, and again, that city is called Leonatopolis. That's Leo or it's in Leon, or City of the Lions is the name of the place, the City of the Lions. And it's in the city of Heliopolis in Egypt, which we now refer to as the city of Cairo. But Heliopolis is where Joseph was living in Egypt when he was in Egypt during the Egyptian captivity. The glorious uprising of the Maccabees called forth the national elements left in Israel and kindled afresh the smoldering religious feeling. It seemed like a revival of Old Testament times when Judah the Hammer, with a band so inferior in number and discipline, defeated the best of the Syrian army, led by its ablest generals, and on the anniversary of its desecration by heathen rites, set up again the great altar of burnt offering. It appeared as if the new theocracy were to be inaugurated. The ceremonial of all of those feasts of the new dedication of the temple, with each night the number of lights growing larger in the winter darkness, seemed symbolic of what was happening before Israel. But the Maccabees were not the Messiah, nor yet the kingdom, which their sword would have restored, that of heaven, with its blessings and peace, if ever Israel might have learned what a Savior is to look for. So he's talking about how when the Maccabees defeated, and remember, this is a civil war. This is not simply, they didn't just defeat a bunch of Greek soldiers that were living in Israel. This was a civil war between Jews in the country. Some of the Jews were very minded towards Jewish things. Some of the Jews were very minded towards Greek things. And the Jews who wanted to be circumcised, wanted to circumcise their children, teach the Torah, do the law, they killed enough of the Hellenizing Jews that eventually there was a peace agreement made between Judah Maccabee and the Greek rulership of Antiochus, where basically they were like, all right, we'll let you rule yourself, which is common at the time. You'll become a vassal state under Greece, and you'll still continue to pay your taxes to Greece, and you'll still continue, well, I should say Greece, I mean, Antiochus didn't rule the land that we actually refer to as Greece now. He ruled the eastern part of Alexander's empire, over into Babylon and Persia. So basically Israel would have to continue to pay, tribute money to Antiochus, but they would be allowed to rule themselves, and their rulers were called ethnarchs. And that was who the Hasmonean, quote-unquote, kings were. The Hasmonean dynasty is a Levitical dynasty that ruled over the land of Israel, even though technically Judah is supposed to be the ruler, which was brought up at the time, because it was basically the Levites creating their own royal bloodline that had nothing to do with the bloodline of David, which is, of course, why it probably only lasted for a couple generations before Augustus Caesar officially deposed the Hasmoneans and put Herod the Great in as Caesar's friend in the region. The period, even of promise, was more brief than might have been expected. The fervor and purity of the movement ceased almost as soon as its success. It was certainly never the golden age of Israel, not even among those who remained faithful to its God, which those seem to imagine who, forgetful of its history and its contests, would trace to it so much that is so much precious and spiritual in the Old Testament. It may have been the pressure of circumstances, but it was anything but a pious or even a happy thought of Judah Maccabee to seek the alliance of Romans. From their entrance on the scene, the dates of the decline of Israel's national cause, for a time indeed, though after varying fortunes of war, all seemed prosperous. The Maccabees became both high priests and kings. Okay, so here you see Judah Maccabee. He actually died in battle eventually. What happened was his family made a deal with the Greeks. They said, okay, we're going to rule. And the Greeks are like, all right, you continue to pay. Well, Judah Maccabee wasn't going to give up the fight. He was going to continue to fight until all of the Greeks in the land were dead, and all of the people who did not want to continue in the practices of the Torah and the teachings of the rabbis and stuff. He had a group of rabbis that were actually on his side. He was basically like, I'm going to keep fighting until everybody that's our enemies are dead. And the rest of the rabbis that were with him and the rest of the people that became the royal family, the Hasmoneans, were like, whoa, we've made a deal. We need to back off. We've won the war. Let's stop having more battles and let's just, start rebuilding Israel. Well, Judah didn't stop, and eventually he died in combat. And his brother, whose name I can't recall, became the high priest and king of Israel. Excuse me. All right. From their entrance on the scene dates the decline of Israel's national cause. For a time, indeed, though after varying fortunes of war, the Maccabees became both high priests and kings. But party strife, hold on one second. Oh, excuse me. But party strife and worldliness, ambition and corruption, and Grecians on the throne soon brought their sequel in the decline of morale and vigor, and led to the decay and decadence of the Maccabean house. It is a story as old as the Old Testament and as wide as the history of the world. Contention for the throne among the Maccabees led to the interference of the foreigner, when after capturing Jerusalem and violating the sanctity of the temple, although not plundering its treasures, Pompey placed Hyrcanus in possession of the high priesthood, and the last of the Maccabean rulers was virtually shorn of power. The country was now a tributary of Rome, subject to its governors in Syria. Even the shadow of political power passed from the feeble hands of Hyrcanus, when shortly afterwards Gabinius, one of the Roman governors, divided the land into 5 districts independent of each other. Okay, so basically he jumped ahead a bit without letting us know what was going on. So Judah Maccabee defeats the Greeks, and yay, now there's Hanukkah, and there's a great Jewish quote unquote Messiah who's come and defeated these evil Greeks. Well, that's the legend. I mean, that's the myth. That's not. I mean, it is partially reality, but it's like Johnny Appleseed, or it's like a legend of Daniel Boone, and what happened at the Alamo. I mean, yes, a lot of guys that were well known at the time died at the Alamo. But, there's a legend of their greatness and their deeds that really probably exceeds what any human could really live up to. But at the same time, his family, who became the royal Hasmonean dynasty, after a couple generations, 2 brothers were vying for authority, and Hyrcanus II was one of them. And he had a brother who was the other, whose name I cannot recall. So basically, they appealed to Rome to decide the dispute on which brother should be king of Israel, or the ethnarch of Israel. So, of course, Pompey, who was this military general from Rome, was basically like, well, which one of you prefers to have Rome as your friend? And Hyrcanus is like, I want Rome as my friend. So he's like, then it looks like you're going to be the guy who's going to be king of Israel. So they come in, find another little civil war, because here we see, everybody's always fighting over power, right? These kings of Israel are always fighting for power, which is exactly why Samuel said, you don't want a king. It'll be the worst thing that can happen to you. So the Romans come in, Hyrcanus II is placed, quote-unquote, on the throne, and then basically Israel just becomes a tribute state of Rome, which does officially separate it from Greece, so at least I don't have to keep paying to Greece anymore. So, but that begins the decline of Israel into what it was at the time of the Second Temple. Like, Hyrcanus is there, and then when Augustus comes into office as Caesar, he gets rid of the Hasmonean line completely and puts in Herod. And, of course, Herod then becomes known as Herod the Great, and he kills rabbis and royal members of the Hasmonean family. He gets rid of everybody that's in any way a threat to his power. But already a person had appeared on the stage of Jewish affairs who was to give them their last decisive turn. About 50 years before this, the district of Idumea had been conquered by the Maccabean king Hyrcanus I, and its inhabitants forced to adopt Judaism. Okay, so they go down and conquer the Edomites, right? Force them to become Jewish. And so this is where the Idumean line comes from. Herod was an Idumean. Okay, so he though had been forced, his family had been forced to convert to Judaism, but of course all the quote-unquote real Jews who have the blood of the Jew blood in them say, you're not really a Jew, you're an Idumean, right? Excuse me. By this Idumean we are not, however, to understand the ancient or eastern Edom, which was now in the hands of the Nabateans, but parts of the southern Palestine which the Edomites had occupied since the Babylonian exile. and especially a small district on the northern and eastern border of Judea and below Samaria. This is, of course, according to the first book of the Maccabees. After it became known as Judean, its administration was entrusted to a governor. In the reign of the last of the Maccabees, this office devolved into one of Antipater, a man of equal cunning and determination. He successfully interfered in the unhappy dispute for the crown, which was at last decided by the sword of Pompey. And this is what we just talked about with the two brothers vying for the crown, right? So Pompey, the Roman general, comes in and assigns one of them the winner. Antipater took the part of the utterly weak Hyrcanus in that contest with his energetic brother Aristobulus. That's the other guy, Aristobulus. He soon became the virtual ruler, and Hyrcanus II only a puppet in his hands. From the ascension of Judah Maccabee in 166 BC to the year 63 BC, when Jerusalem was taken by Pompey, only about a century had elapsed. Other 24 years, and the last of the Maccabees had given place to the son of Antipater, who was surnamed Herod the Great. So, 100 years is all that the Hasmoneans managed to rule over Israel, and even then it was really as a vassal state of Greece, or should I say Persia, or whatever you would call Antiochus's empire. The settlement of Pompeii did not prove lasting. Aristobulus, the brother and defeated rival of Hyrcanus, was still alive, and his sons were even more energetic than he. The rising attempted by them and the interference of the Parthians on behalf of those who were hostile to Rome, and lastly, the contentions of supremacy in Rome itself made this period one of great confusion, turmoil, and constant warfare in Palestine. When Pompey was finally defeated by Caesar, the prospects of Antipater and Hyrcanus seemed dark, but they quickly changed sides, and timely help was given to Caesar in Egypt, and brought to Antipater the title of procurator of Judea, while Hyrcanus was left in his high priesthood, and at least nominally head of the people. The two sons of Antipater were made governors, the elder Phasaelus of Jerusalem, and the younger Herod, only 25 years old, of Galilee. Here he displayed the energy and determination which were his characteristics in crushing guerrilla warfare, of which the deeper springs were probably nationalistic. The executions of its leaders brought Herod a summons to appear before the great Sanhedrin of Jerusalem for having arrogated to himself the power of life and death. He came, but arrayed in purple, surrounded by a bodyguard, and supported by the express direction of the Roman governor to Hyrcanus, that he was to be acquitted. Even so, he would have fallen victim to the apprehensions of the Sanhedrin. Only too well grounded, he had been persuaded to withdraw from the city. He returned at the head of an army, and was with difficulty persuaded by his father to spare Jerusalem. Meantime, Caesar had named him governor of Caesarea. On the murder... Okay, so that's the end of that paragraph. Let's try to summarize. So here we see Herod gaining power. He's only 25 at this time. This is Herod the Great. So he's 25 at this time. The two Hasmonean brothers are still fighting for power. Pompey has been knocked out of the way by Caesar. And this is, of course, Augustus Caesar. He's referring to him only as Caesar, but it's Augustus Caesar. And there's constant civil war in Israel at this time, as these two different royal family lines, well, I say royal, I mean, they're Levites, but the Hasmonean, the Maccabees, are quote-unquote the Maccabees, right, the hammers, that's Maccabee is the Syrian word for hammer. They are fighting for power among their own family, right, fighting for control of Israel. The Romans have already been brought in through Pompey. Now we've got the Roman Caesar, Augustus. He's saying, quit messing with their stuff. Reassign, these guys to be in control. And Caesar Augustus assigns Herod, who later becomes known as Herod the Great, to be the man there. He gave him control of Galilee, and the other brother was given control of, Phasaelus, the younger Herod, was given control of the Jerusalem area. So we're seeing Herod the Great is basically accumulating power. He's coming in at the head of an army. He's going to conquer Jerusalem, but Augustus Caesar's basically like, this guy is my guy in Judea. He is now the governor of Coelesyria. Essentially, the Sanhedrin is like, Herod needs to be executed because he's been killing Jews, and basically Herod's like, you're not going to do nothing to me because I'm Caesar's man here, and I've also got an army. I'm decked in the color purple because I've got the Roman royalty backing me up, and I've got my own personal bodyguards, and now I've got an entire army. I could attack and destroy Jerusalem myself if I wanted to. You're not going to do anything to me, Sanhedrin. Okay, on the murder of Caesar. Okay, so we were talking about Julius Caesar, sorry. So Julius Caesar had already appointed him the governor there. On the murder of Caesar and the possession of Syria by Cassius, Antipater and Herod again changed sides, but they rendered such substantial service as to secure favor. And Herod was continued in the position conferred to him by Caesar. That's Julius Caesar, and I apologize. I thought it was Augustus Caesar, but we're still talking about Julius Caesar at this time. Antipater was indeed poisoned by a rival, but his sons Herod and Phasaelus repressed and extinguished all opposition. So Antipater, one of his sons was Herod the Great. The other son was Phasaelus, right? When the battle of Philippi placed the Roman world in the hands of Antony and Octavius. Okay, so you need to know who Antony and Octavius are. Antony is Mark Antony, the guy who went down to Egypt to side up with Cleopatra. If you ever watched Cleopatra with Joan, I forgot what her last name is. Her first name is Joan, famous Hollywood actress. She plays the beautiful Cleopatra, and Mark Antony goes down to get her army because she's a Ptolemean princess. She's one of Ptolemy's, great granddaughters. He goes down there and says, hey, I need the Egyptian army, which is really a Greek army, right? Because Egypt had been conquered by Greece. I need you to come and help me defeat the rivals for the power of the Roman Senate because there's a vacuum. For people who don't know, if you've never watched the Shakespeare play of Julius Caesar or anything like that, Julius Caesar was killed by the Roman senators on the Senate floor. And they basically said, thus to all tyrants, right? I think that's what John Wilkes Booth said when he shot Abraham Lincoln in the head. Same thing that they said when they killed Caesar. So Caesar's murdered, stabbed to death on the Senate floor. Civil war breaks out in Rome. There's already civil war going on in Judea at the time. So Mark Antony flees to Egypt, tries to get the Egyptian army to back him up. Octavius, who's the adopted son, who's a nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar, gathers up the Roman army and comes marching into Rome. And then he basically seizes power. And then he sails down to Egypt with an army and attacks Mark Antony there in Egypt, kills Mark Antony, takes Cleopatra hostage, takes her back to Rome, probably to humiliate her and execute her publicly there. She kills herself with an asp. That's the end of the revolt. Octavius Caesar becomes known as Augustus Caesar, or the shining, because August is the hottest month of the year when the sun is shining its hottest. So Augustus is the great glory of the sun. So he is named Augustus Caesar, and he takes over the empire and tries to start lining everything back up the way he wants it. He becomes the first real emperor of Rome. Julius Caesar was the first emperor, but Augustus is the first real emperor of Rome. Sort of like Saul was the first king of Israel, but David was the first real king of Israel. Julius Caesar took power. Augustus Caesar maintained power. He came into office, had the Roman coins minted, went to the Venetian houses of the money changers that were on the Mediterranean and had them print vast amounts of gold coins. Then they moved the printing of the coins to the Capitoline Hill, which is the temple of Jupiter there in Rome, and they started minting all these, official Roman coins, official Roman weights. Everything was, imperial, the imperial weights, the imperial measures, the imperial everything. And that's how Augustus managed to maintain power, because he did it through money. It's said that Rome has a three-prong attack, right? The spear of Trident, which is why when they would salute, they'd salute Caesar like this, because Rome's attack is a three-pronged attack. There's the force of arms, the force of their money, and then the force of their spirituality, which is their, which later became Catholicism. But at the time, it was they would literally come to a land, pray to its gods, make a deal with its gods, and then conquer the people of the land, and officially say to the people, your gods have surrendered this land to us because we are better servants to your gods than you are. All right. Let's see. On the murder of Caesar and the possession of Syria by Cassius, Antipater and Herod again changed sides. Antipater was indeed poisoned by a rival, but his sons Herod and Philias repressed and extinguished all opposition. When the Battle of Philippi placed the Roman world in the hands of Antony, Mark Antony, and Octavius, later Augustus, the former obtained Asia. So Octavius took over the area that we think of as Persia, Babylon, or Asia. Once more, the Idumeans knew how to gain the new ruler, and Phasaelus and Herod were named tetrarchs of Galilee. Okay. Afterwards, when Antony was held in the toils of Cleopatra, because you got to remember, Cleopatra had a son named Caesarion, who was the birth child of Julius Caesar. So this is Julius Caesar's unofficial son, right? And that's where the name Caesarion section comes from, by the way. He was the bloodline heir of Julius Caesar. So that's why Mark Antony went down to Cleopatra. He's like, basically, look, you back me up, I'll put your son on the throne as Caesar's true bloodline royal heir. And Octavius is like, nah, I'm Caesar's son. As far as you're concerned, I'm Caesar's son, and I got a better army, so I'm the one that's going to take over. Which is exactly what happened. Afterwards, matters seemed indeed to assume a different aspect. The Parthians entered the land in support of the rival Maccabean prince Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus. By treachery, Phasaelus and Hyrcanus were induced to go to the Parthian camp and made captives. Phasaelus shortly afterwards destroyed himself in his prison. So that's the brother of Herod the Great, right? So he killed himself in the prison camp of the Parthians. While Hyrcanus was deprived of his ears, so they sliced off his ears, to unfit him for the high priestly office. So Hyrcanus had been high priest. The Parthians slice off his ear and say, well, now you can't be high priest because the Torah says you can't be high priest if you have a flaw, right? While Hyrcanus was deprived of his ears and thusly the high priestly office, and so Antigonus, for a short time, succeeded both to the high priestly office and to the royalty of Jerusalem, because again, this is one of the sons of, remember I mentioned the two brothers that were the Maccabean brothers who fought, and one of them went and basically got a Roman general, Pompey, to back him, and that made Israel a sub-state of Rome. At that point, one of his sons is the one we're referring to now, who became high priest for a very short time, and king, quote-unquote king of Israel. And this is all during the time of the Roman transfer of power between Julius Caesar to Augustus Caesar. Meantime, Herod, who had in vain warned his brother and Hyrcanus against the Parthians, had been able to make his escape from Jerusalem. His family he left to the defense of his brother Joseph in the inaccessible fortress of Masada. Himself he fled into Arabia, finally made his way into Rome. There he succeeded not only with Antony, but obtained the consent of Octavius, and was proclaimed by the Senate to be the Senate King of Judea. A sacrifice on the Capitol and a banquet by Antony celebrated the succession of the new successor of David. So here he's worked his way, this is Herod the Great, he's gone all the way to Rome. This is before Mark Antony and Augustus are having their dispute for the throne in Rome, right? So he goes, and both of them agree that he should be named the King of Judea. So they go and they name him Senate King of Judea. They make a sacrifice at the Temple of Jupiter. They have a big party, and he's hailed as the successor of King David. So basically this is where Herod the Great becomes the official Herod the Great. But he had yet to conquer his kingdom. At first he made way by the help of the Romans. Such success, however, as he gained was more than lost during his brief absence on his visit to Antony. Joseph, the brother of Herod, was defeated and slain, and Galilee, which had been subdued, revolted again. But the aid which Rome rendered after Herod's return from Antony was much more hearty, and his losses were more than retrieved. Soon all Palestine, with the exception of Jerusalem, was in his hands. While laying siege to it, he sent to Samaria, there to wed the beautiful Maccabean princess Meriame, who had been betrothed to him 5 years before. The ill-fated queen and her elder brother Aristobulus united in themselves the two rival branches of the Maccabean family. Okay, so Herod's coming in and saying, look, Rome has declared me king of Judea. You guys are the, quote, royal bloodline from the Maccabees. I'm already betrothed to her for 5 years. I'm going to marry her. And when I do, that'll seal the breach between your warring Maccabean family, and it'll give us all the strength and political authority of the Roman government supporting me as king. Okay? And her elder brother, they united themselves, the two rival branches of the Maccabean family. Their father was Alexander, the eldest son of Aristobulus, and the brother of that Antigonus, whom Herod now besieged in Jerusalem. So basically, their brother is in Jerusalem defending it from Herod, and Herod's marrying the sister of the guy who's defending Jerusalem. All right. Herod now besieged in Jerusalem, and their mother Alexandra, the daughter of Hyrcanus II. The uncle of Meriame was not long able to hold out against the combined forces of Rome and Herod. The carnage was terrible. When Herod, by rich presents, at length induced Rome to leave Jerusalem, they took Antigonus with them. By desire of Herod, he was executed. So Antigonus, who had been holding out the city against Herod, lost because Rome and the Herodium, I think that's what you call Herod's army, right? Herodium. They sieged Jerusalem. Antigonus lost. Herod comes in and says, I'm king by the decree of the Senate. They have named me the successor to David. I married this Hasmonean princess. She's Judah Maccabee's, great-great-granddaughter. I'm going to hold this whole place, and I'm going to be the king of the Jews, and I'm going to be the one you've been waiting on. I'm going to be the Messiah, right? Vespasian also, by the way, declared himself the Messiah. And, of course, Herod had the Romans execute Antigonus. This was the first of the Maccabees who fell victim to his jealousy and cruelty. The history which follows is one of a sickening carnage. The next to experience his vengeance were the principal adherents in Jerusalem of his rival Antigonus. 45 of the noblest and richest were executed. His next step was to appoint an obscure Babylonian to the high priesthood. This awakened the active hostility of Alexandra, the mother of Meriame, Herod's wife. So now his mother-in-law is mad at him because he's made some Babylonian the high priest of Israel. The Maccabean princess claimed the high priesthood for her son Aristobulus. Her intrigues with Cleopatra, and through her with Antony, the entreaties of Meriame, the only being whom Herod loved, though in his own mad way, prevailed. At the age of 17, Aristobulus was made high priest. But Herod, who well knew the hatred and contempt of the Maccabean members of the family, had his mother-in-law watched. A precaution increased after the vain attempt of Alexandra to have herself and her son removed in coffins from Jerusalem. By the way, that's how a famous rabbi escaped from the zealots in Jerusalem when Rome was sieging. He actually went to go see Vespasian, who had not yet been declared emperor, to try to make him stop sieging Jerusalem because the rabbis didn't want to fight. It was the zealots that wanted to fight Rome. They tried to escape Jerusalem in coffins to flee to Cleopatra. Soon the jealousy and suspicion of Herod were raised to murderous madnesses by the acclamations which greeted the young Aristobulus at the Feast of Tabernacles. So dangerous a Maccabean rival must be gotten rid of, and by the secret order of Herod, Aristobulus was drowned while bathing. His mother denounced the murderer, and her influence from Cleopatra, who also hated Herod, led to his being summoned before Antony. Once more bribery indeed prevailed, but other troubles awaited Herod. So Cleopatra, famous, beautiful queen of Egypt, also hated Herod the Great. When obeying the summons of Antony, who was Cleopatra's lover, by the way, Herod had committed the government to his uncle Joseph, who was also his brother-in-law, having wedded Salome, the sister of Herod. His mad jealousy had prompted him to direct that, in the case of condemnation, Merimee was to be killed, that she might not become the wife of another. Unfortunately, Joseph told this to Merimee to show how much she was loved. But on the return of Herod, the infamous Salome accused her old husband of impropriety with Merimee. When it appeared that Joseph had told the queen of his commission, Herod, regarding it as confirming his sister's charge, ordered him to be executed. So the guy Herod placed in charge was executed because the guy Herod placed in charge, that fellow's wife, accused her husband of sleeping with Herod's wife while he was gone. So naturally Herod had Salome's husband killed, who was his own uncle, Joseph, without even a hearing. External complications of the gravest kind now supervened. Herod had ceded to Cleopatra the districts of Phoenicia and Philistia, and that of Jericho with its rich balsam plantations. So he had given the queen of Egypt these districts. Then the dissensions between Antony and Octavius involved him. In the cause of the former, in the war with Arabia. So basically, Mark Antony's like, I want you to come in and help me win this battle in Arabia, whose king had failed to pay tribute to Cleopatra. Herod was victorious, so Herod had taken an army and defeated some Arabian kings who didn't pay the tribute money. But he had now to reckon with another master. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC decided the fate of Antony, and Herod had to make his peace with Octavius. Happily, he was able to do good service to the new cause ere presenting himself before Augustus. So now we see Octavius' name has been changed to Augustus. But in order to secure from all possible rivals, he had the aged Hyrcanus II executed. So the old former king, who had gotten Pompey to help him, has now been executed by Herod, in pretense of intrigues with the Arabs. So he says basically that the Hyrcanus II was trying to work with these Arab kings to defy Augustus Caesar in Israel. Of course, if anything, they were probably trying to get rid of Herod, the, quote, king of Israel. Herod was successful with Augustus, and when in the following summer he furnished him supplies on his march to Egypt, he was rewarded by a substantial addition of territory. So while Augustus is marching down to Egypt, apparently they didn't sail down there, they marched down there around the edge of the Mediterranean, and then passed through Israel, passed through Judea. So Herod, of course, supplies his army with food and rations and, probably fresh horses and clothes and just gifts of all sorts. So as Augustus, soon to be Augustus Caesar, is going down there to beat Mark Antony and the army of the Egyptians, he says, oh, thank you very much. I'm going to give you, Herod, much. When I finish conquering Mark Antony, I will give you much spoil, of what I have taken. Excuse me. When about to appear before Augustus, Herod had entrusted to one Somus the charge of Mariamne, who is his wife, right? He's like, look, take care of my wife while I'm gone. With the same fatal directions as formerly to Joseph. Basically, like, if I don't make it back, kill my wife. Again, Salome, but also by Cyprus, Herod's mother. And again, Herod imagined he had found corroborative evidence. Somaeus, that's the guy he left in charge of his wife, was slain without a hearing, and the beautiful Merimee executed after a mock trial. So he finally killed his wife, his Hasmonean, Maccabean princess wife. He had her killed finally. The most fearful paroxysms, so to say his paranoia, of remorse, passion, and longing for his murdered wife now seized the tyrant, and brought him to the brink of the grave. Alexandra, the mother of Marame, deemed the moment favorable for her plots, but she was discovered and, of course, executed. Of the Maccabean race there now remained only distant members, the sons of Babas, who had found an asylum with Costobarus, the governor of Idumea, who had wedded Salome after the death of her first husband. Tired of him as she had been Joseph, Salome denounced her second husband, and Costobarus, as well as the sons of Babas, fell victim to Herod. Thus perished the family of the Maccabees. So here we see the end of the Maccabean line. Yes, the great Maccabean revolt, which led to the establishment of Hanukkah, which is kept even unto today, and even was kept when Yeshua was there present at the temple, even though he told everyone there, "You are not my sheep, and that's why you don't know who I am." And of course then they tried to kill him. Herod finished off the rest of them. The hand of the maddened tyrant was next turned against his own family. Of his 10 wives, we mention only those whose children occupy a place in history. The son of Doris was Antipater. Those of the Maccabean Marame were Alexander and Aristobulus. Another, Marame, whose father Herod had made high priest, bore him a son named Herod, a name which other sons soon shared. Malthake, a Samaritan, was the mother of Archelaus and Herod Antipas. So when you hear in the Bible Archelaus and Herod Antipas, their mother was a Samaritan woman. And lastly, Cleopatra of Jerusalem bore Philip. So he's saying it's not the Cleopatra that's in Egypt. It's a woman named Cleopatra, a common, Greek name. The sons of the Maccabean princess, as heirs presumptive, were sent to Rome for their education. So the children who actually were from the Maccabean bloodline were sent to Rome to be educated there. On this occasion, Herod received as a reward for his many services the country east of Jordan, and was allowed to appoint his still remaining brother Pharosis, tetrarch of Perea. On their return from Rome, the young princes were married, Alexander to a daughter of the king of Cappadocia, and Aristobulus to his cousin Bernice, the daughter of Salome. But neither kinship nor yet nearer relation in which Aristobulus now stood to her could extinguish the hatred of Salome towards the dead Maccabean princess or her children. Nor did the young princes in their pride of descent disguise their feelings towards the house of their father. At first Herod gave not heed to the denunciations of his sister. Presently he yielded to vague apprehensions. As a first step, Antipater, the son of Doris, was recalled from exile and sent to Rome for education. So the breach became open, and Herod took his sons to Italy to lay formal accusation against them before Augustus. He's like, "Augustus, these are my sons. They are planning to overthrow me. What should you do? What will we do, great Caesar?" The wise counsel of the emperor restored peace for a time, but Antipater now returned to Palestine and joined his calumnies to those of Salome. Once more, the king of Cappadocia succeeded in reconciling Herod and his sons. But in the end, the intrigues of Salome, Antipater, and the infamous foreigner who had made his way into court prevailed. Alexander and Aristobulus were imprisoned, and an accusation of high treason laid against them before the emperor. Augustus gave Herod full powers, but advised the convocation of a mixed tribunal of Jews and Romans to try the case. As might have been expected, the 2 princes were condemned to death, naturally. These are the 2 Maccabean princes, right? The sons from Marame, who Herod had. Let's see. As might have been expected, the 2 princes were condemned to death, and when some old soldiers ventured to intercede for them, 300 of the supposed adherents of the cause were cut down, and the 2 princes were then strangled in prison. This happened in Samaria, where, 30 years before, Herod had married their ill-fated mother. Antipater was now the heir presumptive, But impatient of the throne, he plotted with Herod's brother Pharoas against his father. Again Salome denounced her nephew and her brother. Antipater withdrew to Rome, but when, after the death of Pharesus, Herod obtained indubitable evidence that his son had plotted against his life, he lured Antipater to Palestine, where on his arrival he was cast into prison. All that was indeed needed was the permission of Augustus for his execution. It arrived and was carried out only 5 days before the death of Herod himself. So ended a reign almost unparalleled for reckless cruelty, bloodshed, in which the murder of innocents in Bethlehem formed so trifling an episode. So he's saying that the children killed in Bethlehem. Remember, the Christ had been born, and Herod said, "Let me too worship him. Tell me about him. Where would he be?" And they killed all the children in the city that would have been his age. And of course, the Holy Family had escaped to Egypt at the time, being warned in a dream. But Herod still killed all the other children that were there. But it was so little compared to all the other blood that he shed that it doesn't even really make it into the history books. As to seem not deserving a record in the page of the Jewish historian. So it's possible that didn't happen. And see, what did actually happen for sure is that Herod burned all of the family lineage documents that were kept in the temple. Like, the Jews were extremely concerned about who their ancestors were, so when you had a child born, they would register it at the temple, and there was, generation upon generation upon generation. If you read in the Gospel of Luke, it actually says that they counted the generation in Yeshua all the way back to Adam. And they could do that because of the temple records that recorded whose family was whose, all the way up. Well, Herod had all that burned because they kept saying he wasn't a Jew, he was an Idumean, he didn't have any claim. So he just had all the royal documents of lineage burned so that nobody could prove who anybody was born from anymore. And that definitely would have ruined the lives of many people, adults and children, who no longer would be able to know who they were even related to. But we can understand the feelings of the people towards such a king. They hated the Idumean. They detested his semi-heathen reign. They abhorred his deeds of cruelty. The king had surrounded himself with foreign counselors and was protected by foreign mercenaries from Thracia, Germany, and Gaul. This according to the Josephus' Antiquities. So long as he had lived, no woman's honor was safe, no man's life secure. An army of all-powerful spies pervaded Jerusalem. Nay, the king himself stood atop that office. This is from the Antiquities. So he had so many spies constantly in Jerusalem, his army of secret police, basically. If piqued or private enmity led to denunciation, the torture would extract any confession from the most innocent. So this is good old-fashioned secret police, Stasi. Report on your neighbor. Have you heard anyone say anything bad about Herod? We'll arrest them. We'll torture them till they confess. With his relation to Judaism may easily be inferred. He would be a Jew, even build the temple, advocate the cause of the Jews in other lands, and in certain sense conform to the law of Judaism in building the temple. He was so anxious to concile national prejudice that the sanctuary itself was entrusted to the workmanship of the priests only. Nor did he ever intrude into the holy place, nor intervene with its functions of the priesthood. None of his coins bear devices which could have shocked popular feeling, nor did any of the buildings he erected in Jerusalem exhibit any forbidden emblems. The Sanhedrin did exist during his reign, though it must have been shorn of all its power. I mean, it's like a shore sheep. They've been castrated of its real power, right? And its activity confined to the ecclesiastical or semi-ecclesiastical causes. Strangest of all, he seemed to have had at least the passive support of two of the greatest rabbis, that being Peleo and Samius of Josephus. Supposed to present those great figures of Jewish tradition, Abtalion and Shemaiah, we can but conjecture that they preferred even his rule to what had preceded, and hoped it might lead to a Roman procurate, which would leave Judean practical practically independent, or rather under rabbinical rule. So they were hoping for somebody like Pontius Pilate, which would be a Roman procurator, to come, who would just make sure that taxes got paid to Rome, and that the roads were controlled, and that peace was established, and that then they could rule their own people through the rabbinical courts, is what they were hoping for. It was under the government, and in that way somebody would get rid of Herod, or at least end Herod's superpower that he had, because Herod was king of everything, king of the Jews, king of Judea. He had the power to kill. He could kill any person that wasn't quote-unquote royalty, but he had to get Augustus's permission to kill royalty. But it wasn't hard to, say basically that these people were trying to overthrow the Roman government, or just, make up whatever and have them killed. I mean, honestly, this is royalty 101 is what we're reading about. This is what kings do. This is why Samuel said, you don't want a king, Israel, because the king is going to take the best of what you have and make it his own. The king's going to take the best of your sons, make them his charioteers. He's going to take your daughters and make them his bread makers. He's going to take the best of everything you got, because that's what kings do. They are, what is the old saying? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. All right. It was under the government of Herod that Hillel and Shammai lived and taught in Jerusalem. The two whom tradition designates as the fathers of old both gave their names to schools whose directions were generally different, not unfrequently, it seems, chiefly for the sake of opposition. But it is not correct to describe the former as consistently the more liberal and mild. The teachings of both was supposed to have been declared by the voice from heaven, quote, the Bat Gol, as the words of the living God, yet the law was to be henceforth according to the teachings of Hillel. But to us Hillel is so intensely interesting, not merely as the mild and gentle, nor only as the earnest student who came from Babylon to learn in the academies of Jerusalem, who would support his family on a third of the scanty wages of a day laborer, that he might pay for entrance into the schools, and whose zeal and merits were only discovered when, after a severe night, in which from poverty he had been unable to gain admittance into the academy, his benumbed form was taken down from a window sill to which he had crept up, not to lose aught of the precious instruction. So basically saying he'd almost froze to death, climbed up into a window sill to listen to the rabbis teach in the schools. And for his sake did they gladly break on that Shabbat the sacred rest, nor do we think of him as traditional fables of him and as a descendant of David, possessed of every great quality of body, mind, and heart, nor yet as the second from Ezra, whose learning place at the head of the Sanhedrin, whose learning had placed him at the head of the Sanhedrin, who laid down the principles afterwards applied to and developed by Rabbinism, who was the real founder of traditionalism. Still less we think of him as he is falsely presented by some, as he whose principles closely resemble the teachings of Yeshua, or according to certain writers were its source. By the side of Jesus we think of him otherwise than this. We remember that in his extreme old age and near his end, he may have presided over the meeting of the Sanhedrin, which, in answer to Herod's inquiry, pointed to Bethlehem as the birthplace of the Messiah. We think of him also as the grandfather of Gamaliel, at whose feet Saul of Tarsus sat, that's to say the Apostle Paul learned from the grandson of Hillel, and to us he, as the representative Jewish reformer in the spirit of those times and in the sense of restoring rather than removing, while we think of Jesus as the Messiah of Israel in the terms of bringing the kingdom of God to all men and opening it to all believers. And so there were two worlds in Jerusalem side by side. On the one hand were the Grecians and their theaters and the amphitheater, and their foreigners filling the courts and crowding the city, foreign tendencies and ways from the foreign kingdom downward. On the other hand was the old Jewish world, becoming now set and ossified in the schools of Hillel and Shammai, and overshadowed by the temple and synagogue, and each was pursuing its course by the side of the other. If Herod had otherwise everywhere his spies, the Jewish law provided its 2 police magistrates in Jerusalem. The only judges who received remuneration. If Herod judged cruelly and despotically, the Sanhedrin weighed most deliberately, the balances always inclining to mercy. So he's saying that even though Herod just did whatever he wanted to, the Sanhedrin was known for always reclining itself towards mercy in judgment. If Greek was the language of the court and the camp, indeed it must also have been understood and spoken by most of the land. The language of the people, spoken also by Christ and his apostles, was the dialect of the ancient Hebrew, of the Western or the Palestinian Aramaic. It seems strange that this could ever have been doubted. So he's saying that there doesn't seem to be any doubt that the people in Israel spoke Aramaic. But if you had anything to do with trade and commerce, you also spoke Greek. If you had anything to do with the courts, because the Greek courts, you definitely spoke Greek in them. A Jewish Messiah who would urge his claim upon Israel in Greek seems almost a contradiction in terms. So he's saying here that Yeshua would have surely spoke Aramaic to the people. And of course on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, that's Aramaic. We know that the language of the temple and the synagogue was Hebrew, and the addresses of the rabbis had to be targumed into the vernacular Aramean. So he's saying that in the temple and in the Sanhedrin, you'd hear in the temple or synagogue, you would hear Hebrew spoken by the teachers. But those things, when they would read the Hebrew scriptures, they would have a man there called the Targumim who would then translate that into Aramaic, so people who didn't speak Hebrew would understand in Aramaic what was being spoken. Though I do understand that most people who can speak Hebrew can pick up Aramaic pretty quick, and vice versa. There's a lot of similar words between them. And we can believe that in the Hebrew service, the Messiah could have risen to address the... And we can believe that in a Hebrew service... And can we believe that... Read this carefully. In a Hebrew service, that Messiah would have risen to address the people in Greek, or that he would have argued with the Pharisees and scribes in that tongue, especially remembering that its study was actually forbidden by the rabbis. In other words, saying it's ridiculous to think that Christ spoke Greek, because if he'd have gone into synagogue speaking Greek, they would have probably just thrown him out, because they'd been like, look, you're forbidden to even learn that language. The rabbis forbid you to learn the tongues of these foreign kings. Indeed, it was a particular mixture of the two worlds in Jerusalem, not only of the Grecian and the Jewish, but of the piety and the frivolity also. The devotion of the people to the liberality of the rich were unbounded. Fortunes were lavished on the support of the Jewish learning, the promotion of piety, or the advancement of the national cause. Thousands of votive offerings and costly gifts were sent into the temple, bore evidence of this. If priestly avarice had artificially raised the price of sacrificial animals, a rich man would bring into the temple at his own cost the number requisite for the poor. So he's saying that even though they may have raised the price of getting that flawless lamb to a very high price that my poor person couldn't afford anyways, a rich man would have walked in and said, look, I'm going to buy this lamb for all of these poor that I see over here. I want it sacrificed on their behalf and mine. Because that's something you could do with that sacrifice. You could actually go for a whole land and have a single lamb sacrificed for like a whole tribe or a whole land or a whole country. They could do it that way. Charity was not only open-handed, but most delicate. And the one who had been in good circumstances would actually be enabled to live according to his former station. Then, so he's saying even somebody who had at one time been rich could probably get enough charity that he could continue to live like a rich person even when he technically wasn't rich, because they were so giving. Then these Jerusalemites, the townspeople as they call themselves, were polished, so witty, so pleasant. There was a tact in their social intercourse, and their considerationness and delicacy in their public arrangements and provisions nowhere else to be found. Their very language was different. There was a Jerusalem dialect. It was quicker, shorter, lighter, according to Lishan Kalia from Baba K. And their hospitality, especially in the festive season, was unlimited. So he's saying that all these people would come in for Sukkot, and people would hang drapes out on the porch. And if you saw a drape on the porch, that meant, we got room, come in and stay with us in our home. If you're here for the feast, come and stay with our family. They would put, like I said, they would put a drape out and say, come and stay with our family. Sleep on our roof. We've got spare bedrooms to put you up in. Sleep on our porch. Come and fill our home for the festive time and come and be with our family. When they fill up, of course, they take the thing down, but there was people all around who had places open for people to stay. And, of course, there were plenty of people who just had their sukkah out in the street and were sleeping right out in the street in the sukkah, which is a tabernacle or a temporary dwelling. No one considered his house his own, and no stranger or pilgrim would not find reception. And how much there was to be seen and heard in those luxurious furnished houses, and at those sumptuous entertainments. In the women's apartments, friends from the country would see every novelty in dress, adornment, and jewelry, and have the benefit of examining themselves in looking-glasses. To be sure, as being womanish vanity, their use was interdicted to men. So basically, men weren't allowed to look in mirrors at themselves, except in it were that the members of the family of the president of the Sanhedrin, on account of their intercourse with those in authority, just as for the same reason they were allowed to learn Greek. So the chieftains of the Sanhedrin were allowed to look in mirrors to make sure they looked okay, and they were allowed to learn Greek, according to the Jerusalem Shabbat 7d. Nor might even women look in the glass on the Shabbat, but that could only aptly apply to those carried in the hand. So you could only look at a hand mirror on Shabbat. Since one might be tempted on the holy day to do such servile work as to pull out a gray hair with pincers attached at one end of the glass, but not to the glass fixed on the lid of a basket, nor to such as hung on the wall. And then the lady visitor might get anything in Jerusalem, from a false tooth to an Arabian veil, a Persian shawl, or an Indian dress. While the women so learned Jerusalem manners in the inner apartments, the men would converse on the news of the day or on politics, for the Jerusalemites had friends and correspondences in the most distant parts of the world, and the letters were carried by special messengers in a kind of post-bag. Nay, there seem to have been some sort of receiving offices in towns, and even something resembling our own postal service. And at it, strange as it may sound, even a species of newspaper or broadcast sheets appears to have been circulated. These were called the Mikhtabchim, not allowed, however, on Shabbat unless they treated public affairs. Of course, it is difficult accurately to determine which of these things were in use in the earliest times, or else introduced at a later period. Perhaps, however, it was safer to bring them into the picture of Jewish society. Undoubted, and alas, too painful evidence comes to us of the luxuriousness of Jerusalem at the time, and of its moral corruption to which it might lead. It seems only too clear that such commentations as the Talmud give of Isaiah 3:16 in regard to the manners and the modes of attraction practiced by a certain class of female population in Jerusalem, applied to a far later period than that of the prophet. With this agrees only too well the recorded covert lasciviousness expressions used by the men, which gives a lamentable picture of the state of morals of many in the city, and notices of indecent dress worn not only by women, but even by corrupt high priestly youths. Nor do the exaggerated descriptions of what the Midrash on Lamentations describes as the dignity of the Jerusalemites, of the wealth which they lavished on their marriages, of the ceremonies which insisted on repeated invitations to the guests to the banquet, and that men inferior in rank should not be bidden to, of the dress in which they appeared, the manner in which the dresses were served, the wines in fine crystal vases, and the punishment of the cook who had failed in his duty, and which was the commiserate to the dignity of the party, given a better impression of the great world of Jerusalem, saying they would have weddings and not invite people of a lower standing than themselves to the wedding, which of course is probably why Yeshua was like, the master of the house is preparing a wedding, and he says, go out into the streets and get every person you find and bring them into my house for this wedding. Because he's breaking with the custom that was a problem that the Pharisees saw in Jerusalem at the time of not inviting in the lower class into your wedding ceremony. So literally the head of the household is saying in the parable, go out and get every person you can find and bring them in. Fill my house with every person you can find. And yet it was the city of God, over whose destruction not only the patriarch and Moses, but the angelic host, nay, the Almighty himself and his Shekinah, had made the bitterest lamentation. The city of the prophets also, since each of them whose birthplace had not been mentioned must be regarded as having sprung up from it. Equally, even more marked now for joy and triumph, would be the hour of Jerusalem's uprising, when it would welcome its Messiah. Oh, when would he come? In the feverish excitement of expectancy, they were only too ready to listen to the voice of any pretender, however coarse and clumsy the impostor. Yet he was at hand, even now coming, only quite other than the Messiah of their dreams. He's quoting here from Bible. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the children of God, even to them that believe on his name. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. So we learned a lot about all the political posturings and the political machinations that got Herod into power, which ran all through Rome and the Civil War conflict in Rome, and how when he got into office, he went on a killing spree of killing all his challengers. But that, again, that's royalty 101. That's what they all do. That's what Henry VIII did. He got tired of a wife. First wife he got tired of, he sent back to Spain. Second wife he got tired of, he chopped her head off. And so, then the third, too, I think he chopped her head off, too. Point being, that's what kings do. So watch out. You don't want one. That's exactly what Samuel told you, excuse me. So, all in all, Baruch haba Yehovah, dare I say it, Baruch haba Hashem, Baruch haba Adonai. Be blessed in the name of Yod He Vav He, the Most High God, and may your day carry forward with you being his servant and understanding your place as a slave